The old man shuffled into the courtroom, his wrists shackled and his head down. "State your name," the clerk asked. His voice shook as he answered quietly, "Robert Stevens, Staff Sergeant, United States Marines." No one could have predicted what was about to happen. As the judge flipped through his case file moments later, her hand froze. Her face turned pale. That name, it belonged to the man who had once carried her brother to safety on a battlefield in Fallujah before disappearing. Robert Stevens, now 69, sat slouched on the courtroom bench. His shoulders were hidden under an old military coat that was 2 sizes too big for him. The harsh courtroom lights highlighted the deep lines on his face, marks of a life filled with loss. He had once worn a uniform and medals with pride. Now, he sat in second-hand clothes from a shelter, waiting for his fate. The bailiff called the case, City of Newbridge versus Robert Stevens. The prosecutor, young and well-dressed, spoke with practiced confidence. "He's been warned several times about loitering behind Jefferson Street Cafe. The owner has filed 3 complaints this month." But what the prosecutor didn't mention was this. Robert never begged for food. He just sat near an alley vent, trying to stay warm when the cold winter night set in. Then, the officer took the stand, testifying that they had found Robert behind the cafe at 11:45 p.m., and that he had refused to leave when ordered. But Robert hadn't refused. He had quietly asked for just 5 more minutes to finish a half sandwich, a small gift from a kind cook. His request hadn't mattered then, and it still didn't now. The prosecutor went on, "This is his 3rd citation this year. We recommend 30 days of community service and a no trespassing order for downtown." The judge's decision would mean that Robert would be barred from the 4th Street shelter, the only place where he could find warmth. It would shut him out from the church meals that were his only source of food. Most importantly, it would leave him alone, out on the streets, during the coldest stretch of the year. Judge Sarah Williams finally addressed him, her voice steady but curious. "Mr. Stevens, do you have legal representation today?" Robert shook his head. His public defender had been pulled into another case on urgent business. "Would you like to speak on your own behalf?" she asked, peering over her glasses at him. Robert cleared his throat, his voice low and rough as he spoke. "No excuses, ma'am. Just needed to stay warm." The judge pressed further, her tone more insistent now. "Why this particular location?" she asked, her expression unreadable but tinged with something else, something more. Robert hesitated for a moment before answering. "James, the cook, leaves food sometimes. I've known him since he was a boy. His father served with me in Desert Storm." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Then she asked, "And your service?" Robert straightened a little, the weight of his words settling over him like a familiar burden. "United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 1995, Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Iraq." His words hung in the air, heavy with decades of service and pride, long buried but now finding their voice for the first time in years. The judge quickly made a note in his file, but something in his military history caught her attention. She paused. Something about Robert's past giving her pause before she could speak again. Before she could say anything, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. A sharply dressed man in a tailored navy suit strode in, walking with purpose. He made his way to the defense table, set down his briefcase, and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, Mark Thompson, I've just been retained to represent Mr. Stevens," he announced, his voice calm and composed. "I apologize for the abruptness." Robert was confused. He hadn't called a lawyer. He couldn't afford one, especially not someone wearing cufflinks and leather shoes. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "This is highly unusual," she said, her gaze shifting from Thompson to Robert. The court was not informed of any new legal representation. Thompson responded smoothly, "It was a last-minute development, Your Honor. I respectfully request a brief recess to speak with my client." Judge Williams studied both men carefully, her face betraying no emotion. "This court will recess for 15 minutes," she said, rising from her seat and stepping briskly into her chambers. Robert leaned toward the stranger sitting next to him, his voice quiet. "I don't have the money for this," Thompson replied softly. "You won't need it. My firm, Thompson, Ross, and Williams, is taking this case on pro bono." Robert furrowed his brow, confused. "Williams, like the judge?" he asked. "Exactly like the judge," Thompson confirmed. Inside her office, Judge Sarah Williams carefully removed her glasses, her hands shaking. After 20 years on the bench, she had learned to control her emotions, but nothing had prepared her for this. "It can't be the same man," she whispered to herself. But the evidence she had was too precise, too clear. She opened a desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, one of herself, much younger, standing beside her brother, Lieutenant Richard Williams. He wore his Marine dress uniform, his arm resting proudly across her shoulders. They were both smiling, full of hope and excitement at his commissioning. Next to the photo, she found Richard's final letter from Iraq. The edges of the letter were worn thin from years of being held and reread, a quiet symbol of her grief. In the letter, Richard had written about a firefight outside Fallujah. His unit had been pinned down, but then Staff Sergeant Jake had charged through the gunfire, dragging a wounded Marine to safety, covering the retreat as others pulled out the injured. Richard had written, "If not for him, none of us would have survived." 2 weeks after that letter, Richard was killed by an IED. Sarah closed her eyes, the memory of that day flooding back. The funeral, the folded flag, the silence of her parents as they grieved, and the Marine who had approached them afterward. He had said, "Your son saved my life. I was the one he carried." But he never finished the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah had never forgotten the Marine's name. David Jake. Years ago, she had tried to find him, hoping to learn more about Richard's final moments, but the military had told her David Jake had redeployed almost immediately. Later, they said he had been discharged due to severe PTSD and a traumatic brain injury. Now, here he was, sitting in her courtroom, a stranger to everyone but her. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Thompson stepped inside, his face filled with concern. "Sarah, what is this?" he asked. Thompson, a former law partner of her late husband and a lifelong family friend, was one of the few people who called her by name. She turned to him, motioning to the photograph in her hands. "It's him, Mark," she said. "The Marine who saved Richard, the one who carried him out of that ambush." Thompson's expression changed as the realization sank in. "The homeless veteran in your courtroom?" he asked, his voice dropping as he processed the information. He paused before continuing. "That's Robert Stevens, the same man you've been trying to find for years." Sarah nodded slowly, her heart heavy. "His service record confirms it," she said. "Fallujah, 2004. Same unit as Richard. He was awarded the Silver Star for the exact engagement Richard described in his letter." Thompson's gaze softened, and he asked, "Does he know who you are?" Sarah's voice wavered as she answered, "I doubt it. I married after law school, took my husband's last name. He wouldn't recognize me now." Thomas, after law school, had taken his last name. Stevens wouldn't recognize her now. It had been 20 years. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "How does a hero like that end up like this, Mark?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "How does someone who once saved lives wind up alone, on trial, just for trying to stay warm?" Thompson shook his head, his voice thoughtful. "In the short time we spoke, I got the sense he's been through more than most people could ever imagine. Severe PTSD after his last deployment. His wife left while he was overseas. His benefits got stuck in red tape. He worked construction for years, until his injuries made it impossible for him to continue. After that, job loss, eviction, and eventually, he ended up on the streets." Sarah closed her eyes, her mind filled with Richard's words. "Stevens was the best of us," he had once said. "The kind of Marine who'd risk everything for his brothers. If I turn out half as good as him, I'll consider myself lucky." Her heart ached at the memory. Thompson's voice softened. "You could recuse yourself. No one would question it." "No," Sarah replied firmly, lifting her head. "I'm not going to let this man disappear again." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "You know there are ethical risks," Thompson continued gently. "But I do," she said, straightening up. "But there are ethical obligations, too, especially to those who gave everything for this country." When Judge Williams returned to the courtroom, she stood tall, her posture perfect, her voice steady, her face unreadable. But those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the papers on the desk. "Mr. Thompson," she said formally, "has your client made a decision?" Thompson stood smoothly, his voice calm. "Yes, Your Honor. We are asking for the dismissal of all charges. Mr. Stevens wasn't trespassing. He was just trying to survive the dangerous cold. We can prove that restaurant employees gave him implied permission to be on the premises." The prosecutor opened his mouth to object, but Judge Williams held up a hand, silencing him. "I have questions for the defendant," she said, her gaze shifting to Robert. "Mr. Stevens, your military file lists Fallujah, 2004. Is that correct?" Robert straightened, a spark of recognition in his eyes as the memories came rushing back. "Yes, ma'am. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." "And on April 17th, were you part of an OP near the western edge of the city?" the judge asked. A flicker of confusion passed across Robert's weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. We were escorting a supply convoy when we got ambushed." During that firefight, Judge Williams pressed, "Did you rescue a wounded officer, Lieutenant Richard Williams, while under enemy fire?" The room fell silent as Robert's eyes narrowed, the name slowly sinking in. Memories from that fateful day stirred deep within him. "Williams," he murmured softly. "Yes, young lieutenant. Brave. Took a hit, trying to pull a wounded medic out of the line of fire." His voice trailed off as his mind wandered back to the past, recalling the heat of battle, the sounds of gunfire, and the chaos that unfolded around them. "I reached him and dragged him behind cover," Robert continued, his voice soft but steady. "He kept shouting at me to leave him behind, to go help the others, but I couldn't." As he spoke, a silver-haired man in a Marine League jacket leaned forward in the gallery, his attention sharp, his focus intense. "And what happened to Lieutenant Williams?" Judge Sarah Williams asked, her expression calm, though something deeper within her seemed to tremble. Robert responded softly, "We got him on the bird, ma'am. He made it to Germany, I heard. But a few weeks later, his convoy hit an IED." His voice faltered slightly, the weight of the years pressing down on him. "For years, I've wondered if saving him just delayed the inevitable. Maybe I made it worse." Before anyone could reply, the Marine from the gallery stood up, his voice firm and clear. "That's him," he said loudly, pointing toward Robert. "That's Staff Sergeant Stevens. I was there. He saved 6 of us that day." A murmur ran through the room, and Judge Williams tapped her gavel once. It was firm, but without its usual force. "Order," she said, her voice quieter than usual. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Robert kept his gaze low, clearly uncomfortable with the attention now focused on him. The older Marine remained standing, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor," he began, "I don't mean to interrupt, but I was there. Stevens took fire pulling that lieutenant out." The prosecutor stood, ready to object. "Your Honor, while Mr. Stevens's military service is commendable, it's not relevant to these charges." Judge Williams cut him off sharply. "The court disagrees. It is deeply relevant." She placed her gavel down slowly, her words final. "This court will recess for 10 minutes." She turned to the bailiff. "Please see that Mr. Stevens remains here." Then, as she started to leave the bench, she paused. Something rare and unspoken passed between her and Robert as their eyes met for the first time, really met. "Mr. Stevens," she said softly, "when I return, there are matters far beyond this case that we need to discuss." In the privacy of her chambers, Judge Williams finally allowed her emotions to surface. She pressed trembling fingers to her lips, as if trying to contain 20 years of grief. After a long breath, she reached for the phone. "Colonel Matthews," she said quietly, "it's Sarah Williams." "Yes, I know it's been a long time, but I need a favor, and I need it urgently." Exactly 10 minutes later, she returned to the courtroom, but she was not alone. 3 Marines followed behind her: Colonel James Matthews, a master sergeant, and a young corporal carrying a polished wooden case. The room gasped, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. At the sight of those uniforms, Robert stood instinctively. His joints were stiff, but his posture straightened. Years of training kicked in, overpowering the effects of time. Judge Williams took her place, but instead of reaching for her glasses, she set them aside. For the first time in her judicial career, she addressed the courtroom not as a judge, but as a person. "Before we proceed," she said clearly, "I must share a personal connection to this case." She turned to Robert, looking him in the eyes. "The Lieutenant Richard Williams mentioned earlier," she began, her voice steady. "That was my brother." Gasps echoed through the room, and Robert's brow furrowed as recognition flickered in his eyes. The air in the room thickened with tension. 20 years ago," Sarah continued, "my brother wrote home about a staff sergeant who saved his life in Fallujah. He said this man ran through enemy fire to reach him after he was wounded, then covered the rest of his unit as they evacuated the injured." Her voice cracked, but she held herself together, her eyes brimming with tears. "That man was Sergeant Robert Stevens." From the gallery, the Marine who had spoken earlier stood again. "It's true," he said, stepping forward. "I saw it with my own eyes. Stevens took 2 rounds pulling that officer to safety." Judge Williams gave a small nod, then continued, her voice quiet but firm. 2 weeks later, my brother was killed in action. At his funeral, several Marines approached our family. They spoke of Richard's courage, but also of the man who had given us 2 extra weeks with him. Time we otherwise never would have had. Sarah's gaze turned to Robert, her voice softening. "After Richard's death, I tried to find you. The Marine Corps said you had redeployed. Years later, I learned you'd been discharged, but no one could tell me where you went." Robert stood silent, the weight of his emotions evident on his weathered face. "I never stopped searching," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "And now, whether by fate or something higher, you walk into my courtroom." She motioned to the colonel standing beside her. "This is Colonel James Matthews," she said, introducing him. "He commanded my brother's unit. He has something to share." Matthews stepped forward to the bench, his presence commanding. "Staff Sergeant Stevens," he began, "the Marine Corps has been trying to locate you for quite some time. Your personnel file was one of thousands reviewed under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. New intelligence regarding your deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan warranted updates to both your commendations and your benefits." The corporal beside him opened the polished wooden case he was carrying. Inside was a medal resting on deep blue velvet. "By order of the Secretary of the Navy," Colonel Matthews announced, "in recognition of extraordinary bravery on April 17, 2004, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Robert J. Stevens, United States Marine Corps." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the significance of the moment settled over everyone. The Navy Cross, the second highest honor after the Medal of Honor, was being awarded to a man who had never asked for recognition, a man who had faded into obscurity for so many years. Robert stood still, the magnitude of the moment beginning to sink in. It was more than just a medal. It was the recognition of a life of sacrifice, a life that had gone unnoticed for far too long.